Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT How to Play video. My name is Truth, and today our analyst will be diving into how to play Time Flies for patch 12.9. Time Flies, you may be asking, what is that? As the name suggests, Time Flies refers to Zilean when paired with Syndra. Zilean tosses a bomb, then either of those units tosses the unit with said bomb into the enemy backline, thus Time Flies. It's been popularized by the streamer Robin Songs, and with the latest patch, it's actually somewhat viable. Of course, we should mention that this is more of a for fun patch. We're highlighting more of a quote, for fun composition, but that doesn't mean you can't climb with Time Flies. We'll be breaking down with what makes this composition strong, what changed to make it viable, as well as the usual overview of items, champions, and augments. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, don't forget to click the links in our description. Give support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT shows and tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to follow our Giant Slayer TFT social medias. Alright, let's get back to the video, but before we dive into how to this composition, let's first answer the question, why play Time Flies? The easier answer is, it's fun. Time Flies is a reroll composition with Zilean as the star of the show, where Syndra or Singed are throwing units around left to right. But to truly answer the question, we must first explore what changed in patch 12.9 to make this board playable. By far, the most impactful were the buffs to Zilean himself. Not only did they lower his max mana by 10, meaning Zilean would cast more often, but they also bumped up the damage of his ability. They also did lower the stun duration, which does lessen the effectiveness of the bomb throwing. But the increase in damage and lowered mana cost is far more impactful. Another buff champion you could eventually use in the composition is Orianna. Orianna got absolutely bonkers adjustments and is crazy good. Being clockwork, it's a natural pairing to have Orianna tossed in for some late game assurance. Scholars also received a buff, specifically for Scholars. This goes well into the overall theme of the war because Syndra and Zyra are already core of the composition, with more mana regeneration and opens up a third item slot on Zilean. Also, playing Scholars gives some late game scaling when Silco is added to the board. Lastly, the new egg system they've added is actually huge for this composition, because the 3 tome traits means it's likely the Time Flies player gets either a Clockwork emblem or a Scholar emblem. Both of these emblems are insanely useful for this composition. Switching gears, there are 2 main downsides for Time Flies. First is the nerf to Zilean's stun duration, specifically at level 3. With it only being 1.5 seconds, it can be tricky to do the wombo combo of bombing a unit and then tossing them to the backline unless the mana is synced up perfectly. The second issue is that enchanters are everywhere currently, receiving huge buffs. That means a primary magic dealer board like Time Flies can struggle to do enough against enchanter compositions. All in all, if you weigh the negatives versus the positive, it's clear that Time Flies isn't quite up to par with the top compositions of the meta, but it's plenty strong to play every once in a while when the stars align and can definitely win games. Let's continue to break down the composition, beginning with the core items. As always, the best way to figure out for any composition is identifying your core item holders. For Time Flies, the main carry is Zilean. Syndra or Zyra are usually for utility and depends on the variation, either Swain, Vex, or Singed are given frontline items. Zilean has an okay amount of viable items to use, but it does depend on what variation you're playing. The 4 more Scholar boards mean Zilean doesn't need a mana generator like blue buff, so you can play a third damage item or something for utility. The most common items we see played on Zilean are Jeweled Gauntlet and Static Shiv. Oftentimes, Jeweled Gauntlet is paired with Infinity Edge. This gives you the most bang for your buck. Maximizing damage per Zilean cast is key to winning rounds. Other possible items are Deathcap, Archangels, or even utility items like Chalice. Those generally go on Zyra or Syndra. If you're not playing Scholars, then you definitely want either Blue Buff or Sojin to help with mana. Overall, if you're looking for the easiest build path, then Static Shiv is a must for magic resistance debuff and Jeweled Gauntlet with Infinity Edge for the big burst of damage. As mentioned already, Syndra or Zyra are generally just given Chalice to boost your backline AP to give them a bit more starting mana. Sojin is also decent on either champion if you're able to 3-star them. Keep in mind, with the Syndra variation, you want to try and match up her cast with Zilean's to toss the bombed unit into the backline, so some type of mana item is usually helpful on her. Frontline items can be any Bramble Vest, Dragon's Claw, Warmogs, or Redemption. There's nothing special here, as you just want whatever your main tank is to live as long as possible. Lastly, we've touched on emblems earlier, but to reiterate, the 2 best are Scholar or Clockwork. An Innovator emblem is also quite good and particularly well with the Singed variation. With items covered, let's move to the core champions and traits for Time Flies. Zilean is, of course, the main carry for this composition. There's two main variations to play, either Scholar Arcanist or Innovator Clockwork. As always, there's plenty of versions in between these, mixing various energies. For simplicity's sake, we're going to focus on two most common variations. The Scholar variation is all about scholars. The core champions are Zilean, Syndra, Zyra, Vex, and Swain. Syndra and Zyra are two baseline scholars you want to use, with Syndra always being positioned nearby Zilean to throw the bombs into the enemy backline. Swain and Vex are there for Arcanist and frontline. Swain naturally goes well with this composition because, being a reroll board, it's relatively easy to hit Swain 3 alongside Zilean 3. This gives you a solid frontline, especially in 12.9 as Morellonomicon was nerfed, meaning fewer players are running anti-healing. Vex can also be 3-starred if you manage to find more of her than Swain. Either way, Arcanist Duo is your main frontline. From there, the easy additions are Clockwork, more Scholars, and Enchanters. Orianna is by far the best champion to add in at level 6, 7, or 8, especially since she was buffed. Fitting 4 Scholar might be a tad difficult without an emblem, but definitely doable. Silco is the best option late game. Kessenin adds some extra frontline, and Renata also proves a decent debuff to the enemy team. The other variation leans more into the innovator side of Zilean, with the core board being relatively similar. Zilean, Syndra, and Zyra are still used, but instead of Arcanist, you want Singed and Echo for 3 innovators. Camille is often the 6th champion to provide Clockwork, but Blitzcrank is also fine for scrap. It's a bit less utility in this version overall, but Innovators and Clockwork naturally pair well together, so this board has an easy late game potential. Either add in 4 Clockwork or go heavy in Innovator. Both versions are viable, and which you play generally depends on what trait your free tome gives you. And of course, there's no hard rule here, as you can always mix and match both variations. All in all, the 3 core champions you always want with this composition are Zilean, Zyra, and Syndra. As long as you have these 3 and hit Zilean 3 on your board, should do well enough in the mid game. The final piece of the puzzle before we do an overview for each stage is Augments. We won't cover every possible augment because, let's be honest, we're almost at the end of set 6 and most players know by now which augments are worth taking compared to others. What we will go over though are a few specific augments that pair especially well with Time Flies. First off, any augment pertaining to Clockwork, Innovator, or Scholar can be quite useful. Augments such as Scholar Heart or Soul, Clockwork Heart, or Innovator Heart. Ancient Thieves gives you another tome of traits to utilize along the free one from the egg. Basically, anything that lets you hit the higher tiers of these 3 traits does quite well in this composition. We don't recommend that early game if there are better options, though the extra go from Scholar Soul or the free Zilean off of Clockwork Heart isn't terrible. Next are variations you can buff Zilean. Lude's Echo, Archangel's Embrace, Battle Mage, and Jeweled Lotus are all augments that add some type of magic damage scaling to Zilean. Be careful with Battle Mage since it does put your Zilean in an awkward position, but the boosted AP can be quite useful. Similarly, any augment buffs your board is going to be good. Augments such as Cybernetic Uplink, Meditation, and Blue Battery provide extra mana regeneration. This is great for a composition that relies on casting often. A few generic augments worth considering are Phony Frontline, Tiny Titans, and Future Sight. Phony Frontline helps shore up any frontline issues or provides an easy blitzcrank bait in corners. Tiny Titans naturally pairs well with any reroll board, especially when aiming for an early game loss streak. Future Sight helps a lot with positioning, as you want the unit being bombed to be tossed into the enemy backline, preferably at their carry. Knowing especially how the enemy's position can help ensure this happens. Finally, Broken Stopwatch. Considering the main carry of Zilean and Orianna is always added later on, Broken Stopwatch is always going to be useful for this board. It does mess up the bomb then toss combo, but leaving your Zilean free time to dish out damage is never a bad thing. To end with, let's briefly talk about each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. The opening carousel priority is either tier, a rod, or a defensive component. Tiers can be used in a lot of different ways for this composition, so having at least one is always good, which puts it at a slightly higher priority. Gloves can also be worth grabbing in case it's being contested later on. Overall, the early game is simple, play to lose. Going on a loss streak is the easiest way to build up your economy for a reroll composition because aiming to win often means leveling, and leveling costs gold. That being said, if you hit a lot of upgrades like Zilean 2 and have items to use, aiming to win can be viable. It's just easier to play a weak board while building your economy. Yordles are a fantastic opener for this. There are a lot of low-cost units for this composition, so holding on to them is worthwhile if it's not costing you interest. Only champion you for sure should buy and keep is Zilean, because the faster you 3-star him, the better. All in all, the early game is simple, so let's move to the mid game where this composition comes online. Once you hit level 6, which will be sometime during stage 3, the goal is to slow roll for Zilean 3. It is also advisable to aim for Singe 3 or Swain 3, depending on which variation you're playing. An upgraded front line will help a lot with scaling into the late game. Other champions you can roll for are Zyra or Syndra, though it's not necessary to keep them 3-star for this composition. Ideally, you want to be hitting Zilean 3 early into stage 4 and no later than stage 5. If you continue losing rounds and keep getting low on health, it's simply worth it to roll down until you hit. Keep in mind this is a reroll composition and sometimes you're going to low roll. That's just the inherent risk when playing this type of board. Alright, you've hit Zilean 3 and maybe a few other upgrades. Now what? Well, as we're transitioning into the late game, the main way to play this out is to level and add in relevant champions or synergies. We highly recommend adding Orianna because of how bonkers her buffs were and how well she synergizes with Zilean. Time Flies doesn't actually benefit that much from higher levels simply because the only 5 costs worth playing are Silco and Jace, depending on the variation you're running. That means you don't have to worry about level 9 and can instead stay level 8 and focus on additional upgrades, things like Vex 3, Orianna 2, and ideally Silco 2 or Jace 2. That said, if your board is stable and you have the economy to do so, then by all means, level to 9. Just be aware you're unlikely to get that much stronger in the late game. Overall, the late game focus should be mostly on scouting and positioning, keeping your Zilean away from obvious threats, and try to have Syndra or Singed positioned nearby the unit Zilean is going to bomb. Keep in mind that Syndra throws the closest unit to the farthest away unit, while Singed tosses towards the largest clump of enemy units. Use this to your advantage when positioning, and by golly, time will fly. That's all for today, folks. As this patch is about turning up the dial to 11, it felt appropriate to showcase a for-fun composition like Time Flies. If you're looking for additional resources to learn this composition, we do recommend checking out Robin's songs, as he's the creator of this composition and still plays it from time to time. Let us know in the comment section down below which composition you would like us to cover in our next How to Play video. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.